Why was Jesus 4 days late? Today on 2:15, we'll find out. All right, so John 11 contains perhaps one of Jesus's most impressive and most renowned miracles, the raising of Lazarus from the dead. This serves as the seventh sign included in the Gospel of John, and it truly demonstrates Jesus's also included fifth I am statement where he says, I am the resurrection and the life. So let's pick it up. Verse 1. Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was the Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. So the sisters sent word to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. But when Jesus heard this, he said, This sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it. John begins by introducing us to the individuals who are largely the focus of this particular chapter, three siblings from the village of Bethany, who proved to be dear to Jesus. That is, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And while John approaches this introduction in a way that seems perhaps maybe to be nonchalant, we are more formally introduced to Mary and Martha in Luke's gospel account. We can see that in Luke chapter 10, verses 38 through 42. Now, as they were traveling along, he entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister called Mary, who was seated at the Lord's feet, listening to his word. But Martha was distracted with all her preparations, and she came up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the serving alone? Then tell her to help me. But the Lord answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and bothered about so many things, but only one thing is necessary. For Mary has chosen the good part, which shall not be taken away from her. The text here, it also clarifies for us back in John chapter 11 that this was the Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, which actually occurs in the next chapter in John chapter 12. So we'll be studying that in more depth during the next episode. Suffice it to say, however, that this event was significant enough to be able to denote the identity of this specific individual, Mary. Verse 3. So the sisters sent word to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. But when Jesus heard this, he said, This sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it. Interestingly enough, we see no request from Mary and Martha for Jesus to come, much less a request for the healing of their brother, most likely because of the reason mentioned here in verse 3, where it says, he whom you love. You see, within Scripture, we see multiple words that are used to express different forms of love in Greek. This love in verse 4 is the word phileo, and it means a friendship or a kinship. You see, Mary and Martha didn't sense a need to ask Jesus to come because he loved him and he had a great kinship or friendship with him. And with that in mind, one can easily imagine that Mary and Martha felt as though with Jesus commonly performing healings for others, even as we've seen throughout prior studies, surely it was a given that he would heal this one that he loved. And for us, this serves as a reminder that as ones whom the Lord loves and as ones who love him in return, we aren't guaranteed healing or prosperity. The life of a believer isn't guaranteed to be easy. And in fact, Jesus, as he addresses the disciples, he points out quite the opposite in John chapter 16:33, where he says, These things I have spoken to you, so that in me you may have peace. In the world you have tribulation. But thankfully, Jesus didn't leave the verse there. He goes on to say, But take courage, I have overcome the world. See, we can be encouraged even in the face of the world's tribulations, even as we endure persecution, knowing that Jesus has overcome. We can also be comforted seeing that Jesus here, he wasn't caught off guard by Lazarus dying. He states this sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it. He saw the end from the beginning. He knew that death would not claim the ultimate victory over Lazarus. And furthermore, he knew that death would not claim the ultimate victory over him. And by extension, he knew that death would not claim the victory over those who believe upon his name. Verse 5. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he then stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. So John emphasizes and reminds us again that Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. And it serves as a reminder that Jesus' delaying, it wasn't a denial of his love for this family, nor is it a denial of his love for us when he seems to delay in response to our requests. In fact, the text specifically cites his love for them as the reason for which he delayed. Jesus had a greater purpose in mind than simply a healing, but rather that he would bring about the true belief of this family, as well as the strengthening of the faith of the disciples. According to this text, it says, he then stayed 2 days longer. And as a recap, at the end of the previous chapter, Jesus, he asserted his deity to the Jewish leaders who then prepared to stone him. As a result, he fled to a place across the Jordan and he began ministering to the people in that region. This leads us here to verse 2 of that chapter, which offers perhaps another insight into Jesus's reason for delaying, where it says, and many believed in him there. You see, Jesus and the disciples' ministry in the region, it was flourishing at the time that the news regarding Lazarus was brought to them. And undoubtedly, many more came to believe in him over the course of the next 2 days. You see, often we are so focused on our circumstances and our tragedies, or what we perceive as God delaying healing us or removing us from our afflictions, that we miss the ways that God uses our trials to affect others and to change lives. Verse 7. Then after this, he said to the disciples, let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. One can almost hear the shock in the disciples' voices here, essentially saying, you're planning to go back? If you return, they will kill you. Jesus, however, once again, he continues to be about his Father's work, reminding the disciples, though they don't comprehend it at the time, that the time for his death was appointed, but had not yet come. He continued to trust in the Father's timing and will over that of his pursuers. And in the meantime, at that moment, they had the light of the world with them, and there was still much work to be done. Verse 11. This he said, and after that he said to them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go so that I may awaken him out of sleep. The disciples then said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. You see, while the disciples didn't understand what he meant, Jesus was the only one with the ability to cure Lazarus's condition. Obviously, death wasn't something that Lazarus was going to recover from on his own. He needed a source outside of himself to give him life. The reality is that we align with Lazarus. We are incapable of reviving ourselves from our state of spiritual death. We need Jesus, the source of life, to revive us. This contrasts with Jesus, who needed no external source of power, but being life himself, he could not remain in the grave. In fact, as he just mentioned previously in chapter 10, he held the authority to both lay down his life and to take it up again. Verse 13. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he was speaking of literal sleep. So Jesus then said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. See, Jesus had the audacity to say that he was glad for their sakes that he was not with Lazarus. He knew that Lazarus's resurrection from the dead would serve to strengthen the faith of the disciples greater than a mere healing could have. He wanted more for the disciples than simply health and healing. While these are good in their own right, the Lord desired that they would have faith and believe in him first and foremost. He desires the same for us as well. Our holiness, along with its eternal consequences, bears far greater importance to him than our temporal happiness. Physical health, wealth, wisdom, and prosperity inevitably fail, but believing upon Jesus Christ, placing our faith in him alone, leads to eternal life. Verse 16. Therefore, Thomas, who is called Didymus, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go so that we may die with him." Thomas here, he's actually the one who's commonly known so often as Doubting Thomas. In the face of what they expected to be great peril and tribulation and potentially even fatality, he encouraged his fellow disciples to be obedient to the Lord and returning to Judea. And as brothers and sisters in the Lord, we are called to encourage and strengthen one another and to spur one another on toward obedience and a deeper walk with Christ, even in the face of hardships. Verse 17. So when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb 4 days. So this time frame of 4 days, it was crucial as it set Lazarus's resurrection apart from others included in the Gospels, mainly in the idea that the prior resurrections happened relatively soon after death. In Luke 7, we actually see the resurrection of the son of the widow of Nain, that they were in the process of carrying the body to the tomb. We can take a look at that in Luke chapter 7. Soon afterwards, he went to a city called Nain, and his disciples were going along with him, accompanied by a large crowd. Now, as he approached the gate of the city, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a sizable crowd from the city was with her. Then the Lord saw her. When the Lord saw her, he felt compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." And he came up and touched the coffin, and the bearers came to a halt. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. The daughter of Jairus also serves as another example, as she died while Jesus was on his way to the home to heal her, being interrupted along the way to heal a woman suffering from a hemorrhage. And while the miracle is recorded in all three of the Synoptic Gospels, we can actually take a look at Matthew's account for this. Matthew chapter 9 is where we'll be looking. While he was saying these things to them, a synagogue official came and bowed down before him and said, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." Jesus got up and began to follow him, and so did his disciples. And a woman who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. For she was saying to herself, "If I only touch his garment, I will get well." But Jesus, turning and seeing her, said, "Daughter, take courage. Your faith has made you well." At once the woman was made well. When Jesus came into the official's house, he saw the flute players and the crowd in noisy disorder. He said, "Leave, for the girl has not died, but is asleep." And they began laughing at him. But when the crowd had been sent out, he entered and took her by the hand, and the girl got up. And this news spread throughout all that land. So one of the reasons that this is significant is because Jewish tradition held that after death, the soul continued to hover around the body for 3 days after departing completely. You see, it was believed that until the 3 days had ended, the soul could return to the body, resuscitating the individual. With this in mind, and for other more practical reasons, the death watch, or the Shemirah as it was called, would continue until the 4th day. And with that in mind, it could have been argued based on this tradition that the previous resurrections were simply the soul returning to the body on their own. Or perhaps the individuals were only presumed to be dead, but they had been mistaken. Yet once again, Jesus approaches the superstitions of that day directly, shattering them in the process and pointing the witnesses of his resurrection to the truth in him. This time frame of 4 days also would have been crucial, as considering the climate in that region, Lazarus's body would have already begun to decay considerably. To help illustrate this point, here's a bit of an idea as to what condition Lazarus would have been in at that point. At the moment of an individual's death, the heart stops, the skin gets tight and ashen in color, the muscles relax, and the body temperature begins to drop 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit per hour. After only 30 minutes, the skin begins to turn purple and waxy, and the lips, fingernails, and toenails become pale. The blood pools at the bottom of the body. The hands and feet of the individual turn blue, and the eyes begin to sink into the skull. And after 4 hours have passed, rigor mortis begins to set in, and it continues even until the 12th hour. After only 24 hours, the body of an individual is the same temperature as its environment, and the head and the neck are now a greenish blue color, which then spreads to the rest of the body. The body begins to emit an odor, and after 3 days, the gas in the body tissues forms large blisters on the skin, and the body bloats and swells and begins leaking fluids. So all of that said, I say all this to make the point that Lazarus was dead. He was very dead at this point after 4 days. There was no chance for the soul returning to the body. Lazarus was dead and he was decaying. Verse 18, coming back into the text in John. So now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. The text states that Bethany was about 2 miles away from Jerusalem. And furthermore, as the text mentions later in verse 55, the Passover was nearing. And with this in mind, more people would have been in the region than normal, making for an even larger crowd of witnesses and mourners. In previous studies, we've briefly examined some of the Jewish culture surrounding weddings, and in many ways, deaths and funerals were approached similarly. Mourning was a 7-day process, and when someone would pass away, their friends, family, acquaintances, and even some strangers would swarm the family to console them and to care for them as they grieve. Verse 20. Martha, therefore, when she heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet him, but Mary stayed at the house. Martha then said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. You see, through Martha's statement of, even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you, it shows, even in the midst of this tremendous tragedy, that she still holds a willingness to trust God. And as a point of self-examination, I think it's important for us to consider how we handle our even now situations when we face them. In regard to our loved ones that are lost and seem to be beyond hope, do we believe that even now God can reach them? When we face infirmities, sickness, and disease, do we believe that even now God can still heal? And in the midst of financial difficulties, when we're not sure how to make ends meet, do we believe that even now God will provide for us? As this miracle will soon serve to exemplify, some of the greatest victories are born out of even now faith. Verse 23. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? So here we see this fifth I am statement included in the Gospel of John. I am the resurrection and the life. Jesus is referring to himself in this way. It bears multiple facets of meaning, as his claim was not that he possessed resurrection and life, as if it was simply something that he did or something that he gave, but rather that he claimed that he himself, his very being and essence, is resurrection and life. He is the resurrection. His very essence breathes life into dead things. Furthermore, his very nature is to redeem and to save. Colossians chapter 1 serves as a great example as we examine this particular statement. Colossians 1, verse 13. For he rescued us from the domain of darkness, and he transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have the redemption, the forgiveness of sins. You see, he and only he can breathe life into our dead circumstances, our dead souls, and our dead ways of living. While he is the resurrection, he is also the life, calling into existence that which did not previously exist. Verse 15, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. Not only is he the originator and giver of life, but also he's the sustainer of life as well. This section here, it finishes up with verse 17, he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. In this, we see that he truly is the resurrection and the life, both saving and sustaining. Returning to the text in John, Jesus, he's specific, using the definitive article, much as he has done in all of the previous I am statements. You see, rather than describing himself as a resurrection and a life, he states that he is the resurrection and the life. To put it simply, there are no alternatives. Life cannot be found in what the world holds valuable: money, relationships, power, influence, physical strength, youth, or vitality. These are held up as by the world as something that's the most important, and that they're the most important things to be attained. And all of these may serve to temporarily ease our desire for fulfillment, but will ultimately leave us empty. Jesus, however, he's truly the one to totally satisfy, as well as the only true source of life. In his first epistle, John explains it in this way in 1 John 5:12. He who has the Son has life, has the life, but he who does not have the Son of God does not have the life. Peter, he also refers to Jesus, referring to Jesus, and he phrases it in this way in Acts chapter 4, verse 12. And there is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven that has been given among men by which we must be saved. All of that said, Jesus poses the question to Martha, do you believe this? This very question is crucial for us as well. In light of all the evidence and the totality of Jesus' claim, do you believe this? Martha, however, back here in the book of John, she gives us her answer. Verse 27. She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I have believed that you are the Christ, the Son of God, even he who comes into the world." When she had said this, she went away and called Mary, her sister, saying secretly, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and was coming to him. So interestingly, Martha's response to Jesus addresses him by 4 messianic titles. She refers to him as Lord, which is the Greek word kurios, and it's used as a title of respect and acknowledgement of someone as superior. Martha's addressing Jesus in this way, it shows her deep respect for him and her regarding him as her authority. She refers to him as the Christ, which is the Greek Christos, meaning anointed one. In the Old Testament, anointing was specifically reserved for kings, the high priest, and for prophets. Jesus served as the fulfillment of each of these offices through his words and his actions. Martha, she continues and she refers to Jesus as the Son of God, identifying Jesus as more than just the Messiah, but as God himself. And last but not least, she calls him he who comes into the world, declaring him to be the one prophesied of in the scriptures. So while the one extra title, sort of a bonus title, it's not directly connected to the previous titles in that same phrase or in that same verse, but she also refers to Jesus as teacher when she's speaking to Mary. And this reveals yet another aspect of their relationship with the Lord. So you see, they didn't view him as their free pass to a miracle. First and foremost, he was their teacher and their master. And this serves as a subtle reminder for us that even in the midst of our trials and tribulations, the teacher has something for us to learn and to grow from. Verse 30. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house and consoling her, when they saw that Mary got up quickly and went out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Therefore, when Mary came where Jesus was, she saw him and fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. So in this initial reaction from Mary, we see that she fell at his feet. This same posture that Mary took when we are first introduced to her in Luke 10 is the same posture that she assumes now. And it will also be where we find her in the next chapter, in chapter 12. You see, to kneel at the feet of Jesus, it implies a submission to his will and a readiness to be obedient, even in the midst of losing her brother. And even without knowing or understanding Jesus' will, Mary was prepared to be obedient to him. She utters the words to him, though, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." The very same words that were spoken by Martha in verse 21. So one can imagine that this had been perhaps the prevailing thought, and it seems conversation for both Mary and Martha over the past 4 days as they questioned why Jesus hadn't come, as they questioned, even as he's dying, why hasn't he healed him? Verse 33, when Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled, and said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. So while verse 35 is famously known as the shortest verse in the Bible, such a short concept carries a tremendous theological weight for us. Jesus wept because he was surrounded by those who were weeping. From this, we see that God sympathizes in our trials. He's not far removed from us, nor is he unable to understand our burdens. Instead, he knows our hurt and is compassionate toward us, even in the midst of it. Jesus wept because of these results of sin. Verse 33 states that he was deeply moved in spirit. And it's the Greek embermaomai, meaning to be moved with anger. Jesus was angry and he wept as he stood in the midst of this toll that sin had taken. Death was and it is unnatural. We were never intended or created to carry its burden. But because of the entrance of sin into the human race and its curse on all creation, death resulted as well, both spiritually and physically. Thankfully, just as he was about to undo this death for Lazarus, he would soon render death undone on our behalf as well through his work on the cross. As a point of interest, when we compare the Greek word that's used to describe the weeping of Mary and Martha and the others with that of Jesus in verse 33, we see that Jesus did not wail loudly like the others, but rather he sobbed. Wailing, it was customary and during mourning proceedings, and it was considered to be a vital part of the grieving process. In fact, it was considered so important that there were even professional wailers. These individuals were hired to attend funerals, to weep and to, in a way, lead others in weeping as well. Yet Jesus was genuine in his reaction. There was no wailing or over-the-top lamenting. He genuinely cared that they were grieving for this brother whom they loved. This serves as yet another way in which Jesus stands as a stark contrast to the pagan gods of the day. You see, whereas Jesus showed compassion in their sorrows and in turn shows compassion in ours as well, the gods of the Romans and Greeks, they were depicted as cold and indifferent toward the plight of humanity. They were often described in a manner that proved them to be far more eager to smite humanity than to sympathize with them. And yet we see that Jesus sympathizes in the midst of our struggles. Verse 36. So the Jews were saying, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind have kept this man also from dying?" The Jews present, they referencing Jesus' healing of the blind man back in chapter 9. They essentially ask, if he could do that, why didn't he heal this one whom he loved? Yet in all of this, we see that Jesus accomplishes both through his work on the cross, saving us from spiritual death, thereby granting us eternal life and healing of us, of our spiritual blindness as well. Verse 38. So Jesus, again being deeply moved within, came to the tomb. Now it was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Remove the stone." Martha, the sister of the deceased, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be a stench, for he has been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, Did I not say to you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they removed the stone. Then Jesus raised his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but because of the people standing around, I said it, so that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. So here we see that Jesus had the stone removed prior to resurrecting Lazarus. He wasn't concerned about the state of Lazarus's body, nor was he concerned about the stench that undoubtedly would have resulted. And this holds a parallel for us today even as well. You see, when we come to the Lord, we aren't required to clean ourselves up first. He calls us as we are, even though we carry the stench and decay of sin. However, he takes it a step further, as we aren't called to resurrection in new life through Christ to remain dwelling in our tombs, but rather we are called to leave the darkness and to walk in his light, allowing him to cleanse us of unrighteousness. Jesus here, he calls Lazarus forth, speaking with the authority that could only be held by one with the power over death. It's quite possible that had Jesus not used Lazarus's name, the very power of his voice would have opened the tombs of others who had died before. As you may recall, Jesus mentioned in John chapter 5, verse 25, that where he says, Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming, and now is, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. Truly, he is the resurrection and the life, and he demonstrates as much through the seventh sign. Verse 44. The man who had died came forth, bound hand and foot with wrappings, and his face was wrapped around with a cloth. Jesus said to them, Unbind him and let him go. We see here that this passage ends abruptly. We aren't afforded a glimpse at the reunion, nor are we given the opportunity to see as the mourning was undoubtedly displaced by celebration. This perhaps draws attention to an important contrast between Lazarus' resurrection and the eventual resurrection of Jesus. You see, Lazarus still had his grave clothes, and he would eventually have need of them again. Jesus, however, left his behind in the tomb, having defeated death, never to die again. Verse 45. Therefore, many of the Jews who came to Mary and saw what he had done believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them the things which Jesus had done. So much like the surrounding witnesses that day, we can either choose to embrace the truth of who Christ is, that he is the Lord of all, the resurrection and the life, and through that walk and surrender to his will for us, or we can choose to continue in disbelief. Verse 47, therefore, the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council and were saying, What are we doing? For this man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. The Pharisees' assessment of the situation at hand was correct. If they were to have left Jesus alone, rather than attempting to interfere, the logical conclusion would be to believe in Jesus, as his works and his teachings were witnessed. However, as they mentioned, their concern wasn't regarding the spiritual well-being of the people of Israel. Rather, their focus was on maintaining their power and influence, which Jesus was disrupting. Verse 49. But when one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, You know nothing at all, nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man die for the people, and that the whole nation should not perish. Now he did not say this on his own initiative, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but in order that he might also gather together into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. Caiaphas, being the high priest at that time, unknowingly prophesied of the impact of Jesus' death, the death which they were plotting. He says in verse 50, It is expedient for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation should perish. Essentially meaning it would be more beneficial that this one man die rather than for Rome to assert their authority, resulting in the deaths of many in the process. Jesus, however, would indeed die, not just for Israel, but for all of humanity, in order that he might also gather together into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. Verse 53. So from that day on, they planned together to kill him. Therefore, Jesus no longer continued to walk publicly among the Jews, but went away from there to the country near the wilderness into a city called Ephraim. And there he stayed with the disciples. Now the Passover of the Jews was near, and many went up to Jerusalem out of the country before the Passover to purify themselves. So they were seeking for Jesus and were saying to one another as they stood in the temple, "What do you think, that he will not come to the feast at all?" Now the chief priests and Pharisees had given order that if anyone knew where he was, he was to report it so that they might seize him. So the text states that, so from that day on, they planned together to kill him. And until this point, Jesus' pursuers were mostly the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin. Now, however, even the high priest was involved in the plot to kill Jesus. And the Passover was indeed drawing near. This would serve as the time frame for which Jesus would be crucified. And in doing so, he would, unbeknownst to the Jewish leaders, serve as the Passover lamb, pure and spotless, sacrificed for the sins of the world. So this brings us to the end of chapter 11. And the next episode we'll be examining as Jesus begins to turn his attention to the cross and preparing his followers for his death. I pray that this study has been a blessing to you and that you've found it fruitful in your walk with the Lord. Please consider subscribing to stay up to date as new episodes are being released weekly. And it's also really a tremendous help and support for the ministry as well. All in all, thanks for watching.